The air in the solicitor's office was thick with the scent of old paper and stale grief. A fine layer of dust coated the mahogany desk, dancing in the single beam of afternoon light that pierced the heavy velvet curtains. I sat in a stiff-backed chair, my hands clasped so tightly in my lap that my knuckles were white. My name is Eleanor, and I was listening to the last will and testament of my grandfather, George. Across from me sat my uncle, Robert, his wife, and their 2 sons. They were the picture of solemnity, but I could see the restless anticipation in their eyes. They had always been closer to Grandpa in proximity, living just a town over, while I had moved to the city for university and then for my career. But proximity and affection are 2 different currencies, and I had always believed my bond with Grandpa George was forged in something far more valuable. He was the one who taught me how to identify constellations on clear summer nights, his voice a low, gentle rumble as he traced the stars with a trembling finger. He was the one who patiently held the back of my bicycle long after I could balance on my own, just to give me the confidence to pedal faster. His workshop, filled with the smell of sawdust and varnish, was my sanctuary, a place where he'd let me help with his woodworking projects, my small hands fumbling with sandpaper as he carved intricate birds from blocks of pine. The solicitor, a man with a weary face and spectacles perched on the end of his nose, droned on in a monotone voice, listing assets and bequests. The house went to Robert, as expected. Various sums of money were allocated to my cousins for their education. A collection of antique stamps was gifted to a distant relative I'd met only once. I waited, my heart a nervous drum against my ribs. I didn't expect a fortune, but I longed for a mention, a small token, a final acknowledgement of the world we had shared. I imagined he might have left me his old woodworking tools or his collection of well-loved poetry books, the things that held our memories. But as the solicitor read the final clause, my name was never spoken. The air left my lungs in a silent rush. There was nothing. Not a book, not a tool, not a single, sentimental penny. It was as if I had been erased. A polite, concluding statement was made, and the rustle of papers signaled the end. My uncle offered me a tight, sympathetic smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Well, Eleanor," he said, his voice laced with a hollow sort of pity. Dad's mind was a bit scattered at the end. "Don't take it personally." His words were meant to be a balm, but they felt like acid. Scattered? Grandpa's mind had been as sharp as the chisels he used to carve with. We had spoken just a week before he passed, a long, rambling phone call about a documentary I had watched on migrating birds. He had been lucid, funny, and warm, the same man I had adored my entire life. The idea that he had simply forgotten me was more painful than the thought of being intentionally snubbed. It felt like a betrayal of every secret shared, every lesson taught, every quiet moment of understanding that had passed between us. As my relatives began to murmur amongst themselves, gathering their coats and their newfound inheritances, I remained frozen in my chair. A profound and hollow emptiness opened up inside me. It wasn't about the money or the objects. It was about the story. Our story. Had it meant nothing? Was I just a footnote in his life, easily discarded when it came to the final chapter? That's when a quiet voice cut through my spiraling thoughts. "Miss Eleanor?" I looked up to see an elderly man standing near the doorway. He was tall and lean, with a kind face etched with the fine lines of a long life, and he held a worn flat cap in his hands. I recognized him instantly. It was Mr. Peterson, my grandfather's closest friend. They had been inseparable for as long as I could remember, a pair of old soldiers who navigated the landscape of their golden years together, sharing coffee at the diner every morning and spending long afternoons tinkering in Grandpa's workshop. He gave a slight, respectful nod. "I wonder if I might have a word with you?" he asked, his voice soft but clear. I could only nod, my own voice lost somewhere in the lump that had formed in my throat. My uncle and his family paid him no mind, too engrossed in their own affairs as they filed out of the office. Mr. Peterson waited patiently until the door clicked shut behind them, leaving the 2 of us alone with the solicitor, who was now busy organizing his files. He walked over slowly and took the seat my uncle had just vacated. He didn't speak for a moment, simply looked at me with eyes that were full of a deep, knowing sadness. He had been at the funeral, of course, standing quietly at the back, but we hadn't had a chance to speak. That was a difficult thing to sit through, he said finally, his gaze unwavering. "I saw your face when the reading was over. You're thinking he forgot you." Tears pricked my eyes, hot and shameful. I looked down at my hands, unable to meet his gaze. "I don't know what to think," I whispered. Mr. Peterson sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of years. George didn't forget you, Eleanor. He couldn't have forgotten you if he tried. He paused, leaning forward slightly, his expression earnest. In fact, you're the very reason he died smiling. His words hung in the silent office, a stark contrast to the dry, legalistic language that had filled it just moments before. The reason he died smiling? I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. The phrase made no sense. How could a man who had seemingly erased his only granddaughter from his final wishes die with a smile on his face because of her? It felt like a cruel paradox. Mr. Peterson's kind eyes held mine. George loved you more than anything, Eleanor. You have to believe that. His pride in you was, well, it was the sun in his sky, especially these last few years. He gestured vaguely back toward the door through which my relatives had departed. They were here, he said with a sigh, but you were with him, in his heart, in his mind, every single day. My confusion deepened. But the will, why would he leave me out completely? Uncle Robert said his mind was failing. A sad smile touched Mr. Peterson's lips. George's body was failing, my dear. His hands grew stiff, his steps became slow. But his mind? His mind was on a mission. He was more focused than I'd seen him in years, all because of a final project. A project for you. He leaned back in the chair, his gaze distant, as if watching a memory unfold. He talked about you constantly. Eleanor's got a good head on her shoulders, he'd say. She's making her own way in the world. She doesn't need my money. He was so proud that you were independent, that you built a life for yourself on your own terms. The tears that had threatened before now began to fall, silent tracks on my cheeks. This was the grandfather I knew, the one who valued strength, character, and hard work above all else. He didn't want to leave you a check that you'd cash and forget, Mr. Peterson continued, his voice soft. He wanted to leave you his story, your story together. He believed that was the only inheritance that truly mattered. He rose slowly from his chair. Come with me, Eleanor. There's something you need to see. Something he entrusted to me to show you when the time was right. I followed him out of the stuffy office and into the cool afternoon air. The familiar streets of my grandparents' town seemed both the same and irrevocably different. We walked in silence for a while, the rhythmic tap of Mr. Peterson's walking stick on the pavement the only sound between us. We passed the park where Grandpa George had pushed me on the swings, his deep laughter echoing in my memory. We passed the bakery where he'd buy me a gingerbread man after every visit to the dentist. Each landmark was a fresh pang of grief, a reminder of the bond I had thought was severed. He was worried he wouldn't have enough time to finish, Mr. Peterson said, breaking the silence as we turned onto Grandpa's street. His hands, the arthritis was bad. Some days he couldn't hold the tools at all. He'd just sit in his workshop surrounded by wood and plans and look at his hands with such frustration. But he never gave up. He'd always say, I have to get this done for Eleanor. We arrived at the small, tidy house. It already felt empty, a mere shell of the home it had been. My uncle's car was gone. I imagined them at a restaurant, toasting to their new assets, while I was walking toward a ghost. Mr. Peterson, however, didn't lead me to the front door. Instead, he guided me around the side of the house, along a stone path now sprinkled with fallen autumn leaves, toward the place that had always been my grandfather's truest home, the workshop at the back of the garden. The small wooden building stood exactly as I remembered it, nestled under the shade of a large oak tree. The paint was a little more peeled, the wood a little more weathered, but it was the same sanctuary I had known my entire life. Mr. I. Peterson reached into his pocket and pulled out a single, old-fashioned brass key. It wasn't the key to the main house. This one was different, more ornate. He gave this to me a few days before he passed, he explained, holding it out to me. He said, Robert will get the house key, but this one is for Eleanor. She'll know which door it opens. Tell her. Tell her my greatest treasure is inside. My hand trembled as I took the key from him. It felt warm, as if it still held the heat of my grandfather's palm. I knew the door instantly. I walked up the 2 wooden steps to the workshop, the place of sawdust and secrets, and slid the key into the lock. It turned with a satisfying, heavy click. For a moment, I hesitated, my hand on the doorknob, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. What was inside? What could possibly explain everything? Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The scent hit me first, a wave of familiar comfort that was pure Grandpa George. It was the rich, earthy smell of pine and cedar, the sharp tang of varnish, and the faint, sweet perfume of sawdust. For a moment, my eyes stung with a fresh wave of grief for the man who was the soul of this place. The workshop was his kingdom. and as my eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the dusty window, I saw that he had not left it empty. The space was surprisingly tidy, not the creative chaos I remembered. Tools were cleaned and hung in their precise places on the wall, the floor was swept, and jars of screws and nails were neatly labeled. It was as if he had been preparing for a visitor. And in the very center of the room, where his main workbench once stood, was his final project. It was a chest. A large, beautiful hope chest, crafted from a deep, honey-colored oak. It wasn't ornate or flashy, but the quality of the workmanship took my breath away. The joints were seamless, the surface polished to a soft, glowing sheen that invited a touch. The front panel was adorned with a single, exquisitely carved image. A great oak tree, its branches reaching wide, mirroring the very tree that sheltered the workshop. I ran my fingers over the carving, feeling the delicate texture of the leaves, the deep grooves of the bark. This was the work of a master, but more than that, it was the work of a man pouring all his love into a final, tangible form. He worked on it for the better part of a year, Mr. Peterson said softly from behind me. It was the last thing he made. With a trembling hand, I lifted the heavy lid. The hinges moved without a sound. The inside was lined with deep blue velvet, the color of a twilight sky. But it wasn't empty. It was filled with smaller, individually carved wooden objects, each nestled in its own compartment, and tied to each one with a simple twine ribbon was a small, folded piece of paper. My fingers, almost of their own accord, reached for the first object. It was a perfect miniature replica of my first bicycle, complete with tiny, intricate spokes on the wheels and handlebars that actually turned. A shaky laugh escaped my lips as I held it in my palm. I remembered that bicycle, the scraped knees, and the triumphant feeling when I finally pedaled away on my own. I carefully untied the ribbon and unfolded the note. The handwriting was my grandfather's, a bit shaky, the letters less firm than I remembered, but unmistakably his. For my Eleanor, the note began. Do you remember this bike? You were so afraid to let go, but so determined to fly. I ran behind you for what felt like miles, my hand on your seat. The moment you finally balanced on your own, you looked back at me, and your smile was like the sun coming out from behind the clouds. I knew then that you were a force to be reckoned with. This bike isn't for looking back, my dear. It's to remind you to always keep pedaling forward, even when you're afraid. Tears dripped onto the note as I read his words. I gently placed the tiny bicycle back in its velvet nest and reached for another object. It was a small, flat box, no bigger than my palm. On the lid was a carved representation of the Orion constellation, each star a tiny, inlaid dot of lighter wood. I opened it, and inside the velvet was empty, but the accompanying note explained why. This is for the nights we spent in the garden, he wrote. I taught you the names of the stars, but you taught me to see the wonder in them again. You'd ask a million questions, and your curiosity made the whole universe feel new to me. I wanted to fill this box with starlight for you, but that's an impossible task. So instead, I leave it empty to remind you to always look up. The world is full of wonders, Eleanor, and I never want you to lose your gift for seeing them. I sank to my knees before the chest, overwhelmed. This was my inheritance. Not a check to be cashed, not a house to be sold, but a treasure chest of memories, each one a testament to our bond. I saw a small carved bird, a tiny book with a wooden cover, a miniature swing set. Each was a story, a piece of our shared history, brought to life by his loving, tired hands. The arthritis in his hands was terrible near the end, Mr. Peterson said, his voice thick with emotion. Some days he could barely hold a cup of coffee, let alone a chisel. But he would come out here every single day and work for as long as he could bear the pain. He'd say, "Every minute I spend on this is a minute I'm spending with Eleanor." He wasn't forgotten, my dear. You were the reason he got up every morning. I finally understood. The will was a formality, a distribution of material things to the people who needed them. But this was his heart. This was his soul. This was his final letter to me, written in the language he knew best, the language of wood, patience, and unwavering love. I spent what felt like an eternity on the floor of that dusty workshop, a sacred space where time seemed to have stopped. I was lost in the world my grandfather had built for me. Each object was a key, unlocking a room in my memory I hadn't visited in years. My grief had not vanished, but it was changing, transforming from a hollow ache of abandonment into a profound, overwhelming sense of love returned. There was a small, intricately carved wren, its head cocked as if listening. The attached note told the story of the disastrous yet perfect day we built a birdhouse together. He wrote about how I had hammered my own thumb by mistake, and how I had cried more out of frustration than pain. You refused to give up, the note read. You just stuck a plaster on your thumb and insisted we finish before the birds got homeless. That stubbornness, Eleanor, is your superpower. Never let anyone tell you otherwise. I reached for another piece, a perfectly smooth, flat stone carved from maple wood. It felt cool and solid in my hand. I knew instantly which day this represented. Do you remember this afternoon at Miller's Pond? The note began. You were so frustrated you couldn't make the stone skip more than twice. I told you it wasn't about the number of skips, but about the ripples you make. They travel farther than you can see. Be like this stone, Eleanor. Make good ripples in the world. They will touch shores you never even dreamed of. A sob caught in my throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated love. All this time I had felt a growing distance between us, an ocean created by miles and the diverging paths of our lives. I had mourned him as a man I had lost, but this chest revealed a man I never fully knew. A man whose love was an active, breathing force, a constant presence even when I couldn't see it. He hadn't felt the distance at all. He had been right here with me, paying attention, cherishing every conversation, and turning them into these permanent, beautiful markers of our bond. Mr. Peterson had taken a seat on a nearby stool, watching me with a gentle patience. He was so secretive about this, he said, a fond smile in his voice. He called it Operation Eleanor. I was the only one he let in on it. I remember one afternoon your Uncle Robert dropped by unexpectedly to bring him some groceries. George threw the dusty sheet over the chest so fast he nearly knocked over a can of varnish. Robert, bless his heart, is not the most observant man. He asked what was under the sheet, and George, without missing a beat, said, "Just a failed experiment in cabinet making. Utter rubbish. Not my best work." The irony was so thick you could have cut it with a saw. The whole time Robert was here, George stood in front of the chest like a guard at Buckingham Palace. The image of my gruff, gentle grandfather engaged in such subterfuge, like a boy with a secret clubhouse, made a small laugh bubble up through my tears. Mr. Peterson's expression sobered, but the fondness remained. There was a day, about a month ago. It was a bad day. The pain in his hands was so severe he couldn't even close his fingers into a fist. He just sat on this stool, staring at the chest. I told him, "George, you've done more than enough. She will love it just as it is." But he just shook his head. He pointed to one of the empty compartments inside. Mr. Peterson's voice grew softer, drawing me into the memory. He said, "There's one piece missing, Pete. It's the most important one. It's the smile." I didn't understand what he meant. He was weak that day, and I worried he was getting confused. I suggested he rest, that he'd done more than any man could. He tried to pick up a small carving knife and dropped it. It just clattered on the floor. I thought for sure he was going to give up. I looked up from the chest, my eyes meeting the old man's. But he didn't, did he? "No," Mr. Peterson confirmed, his eyes gleaming with pride for his friend. He was quiet for a long time. The next morning, he called me at dawn, his voice full of a crackling energy I hadn't heard in ages. "I figured it out," he said. "It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be real." He spent the next 3 days working on that last piece. He didn't eat much, he didn't sleep much. He just worked, and he hummed. I hadn't heard him hum in years. My eyes scanned the remaining compartments, my heart pounding. I was searching for what he was talking about, and then I saw it. Tucked into a corner, almost hidden, was a simple, unadorned block of pine. It was smaller than the others, and unlike the flawlessly carved objects surrounding it, this one was rough, imperfect. It was a crude, almost childlike carving of a smiling face. The eyes were uneven, the mouth a bit lopsided. The tool marks were shaky, evidence of the pain he had fought through, but it radiated an unmistakable, pure joy. It was the most beautiful thing in the entire chest. The note attached was the shortest of all. "This is your smile, Eleanor. The one you gave me on the phone. The one I saw in my mind's eye every time I thought of you. It's not my best work. My hands failed me here. But this smile is the reason I got through the pain. This smile is the treasure I took with me. Keep smiling, my dear." And then I knew. I finally understood the words Mr. Peterson had spoken in the solicitor's office. "The day he passed," Mr. Peterson said, his voice now thick with unshed tears. "The nurse told me he was peaceful. She said that just before the end, a soft smile spread across his face, and it stayed there. She thought he must have been having a beautiful dream." He looked at me, his eyes full of a profound certainty. "But it wasn't a dream, Eleanor. He was finishing his last piece. He was thinking of you. You are the reason he died smiling." The crude wooden smile rested in my palm, feeling warmer and heavier than any block of pine had a right to. The tears that fell now were different. They were not tears of sorrow or loss, but of a profound and cleansing gratitude that washed over me, healing the wound that had been torn open in that stuffy solicitor's office. I had walked in there feeling like a forgotten footnote and was leaving carrying the entire story. I looked from the small, imperfect carving to Mr. Peterson's kind, weathered face, my vision blurred. "Thank you," I said, my voice choked with an emotion so deep I could barely speak. "Thank you for showing me this." "I was just the messenger," he said gently, placing a comforting hand on my shoulder. "All the real work was done by him. He made sure of it." He gestured around the workshop, his hand sweeping across the neatly hung tools and stacks of lumber. This was his happy place, especially this last year. He wasn't dwelling on what he was losing. He was focused entirely on what he was leaving behind. "Not for them." He nodded back towards the main house, a gesture devoid of malice, full of simple truth, "but for you." I gently placed the small smile back into its velvet-lined compartment, alongside the constellations, the bicycle, and the skipping stone. My inheritance wasn't a sum of money to be deposited or a property to be managed. It was a library of love, a collection of moments that defined not just his life but mine. He had given me back my own history, polished and presented with a love so fierce it had defied arthritis, exhaustion, and even death itself. He hadn't left me something to own. He had left me something to be. He once told me, Mr. Peterson recalled, his gaze distant, that money is like water. It flows through your fingers and is gone. A house is just walls and a roof that will one day belong to someone else. But a story is a seed. You plant it in someone's heart, and it grows forever. He smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached his eyes. He chose to plant his best stories in you, Eleanor. I slowly and carefully closed the heavy oak lid of the chest. The sound it made was not one of finality, but of safekeeping. The contents were secure, but their meaning was now free, living and breathing inside me. The crushing weight in my chest had lifted, replaced by a quiet, unshakable strength. Grandpa George hadn't forgotten me. He had immortalized me. He had seen me, truly seen me, and in his final, most difficult act, he had made sure that I would see it too. I stood up, my legs feeling steady for the first time all day. I looked around the quiet workshop, at the tools that still held the memory of his grip, and I felt not an ending, but a continuation. This place was not a tomb, but a cradle, the birthplace of his last and greatest gift. "I'll have to arrange to get this home," I said, my voice finally clear and calm. "It will be here for you whenever you're ready," Mr. Peterson assured me. We walked out of the workshop and into the late afternoon sun, which now seemed warmer, softer. The world no longer felt cold and empty. It felt full of stories waiting to be noticed, full of ripples waiting to be made. My grandfather's will had been read, and my name wasn't mentioned, but I had received the entire legacy. He left me no money, but he made me the richest person I knew. He had left me with a purpose, to live a life that was worthy of his final smile. And I would. True legacies are not written on paper, they are etched into our hearts. The greatest inheritance we can receive is the memory of being loved, and the greatest gift we can leave behind is a story of love for others to carry forward. If this story resonated with you, consider sharing it with someone who might need a reminder that love is the most valuable treasure of all.